Now I imagine you're thinking, wait, wasn't this a Baba Lysaga video? It is, don't worry, we'll get there. I've played Magic for a really long time, and when I most recently came back to Magic, it was because of Commander. Merrin was the first Commander deck that I built. I've always loved Golgari and recursion value engines, so it was a really natural fit. It was because of my love of Merrin that I watched a video by a fantastic human, Joey Schultz, from the EDH Rec podcast. We talked about taking apart his favorite deck, spoiler alert, it was Merrin, to build his new love, Baby Lasagna. Ever since I watched that video, I wanted to make a Baba Lysaga deck of my own, but I didn't really want to invest a couple of $100 into it. A recent surge of budget deck brewing in my playgroup was the perfect excuse to see if I could create a Baba deck worth playing at precon level prices. Baba is a 3/3 for 3 mana, but her ability is all that really matters here. You can tap her and sacrifice 3 permanents of different types, and if you do, you get to draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, and drain your opponents of 3 life. An incredible value engine, to say the least. It's this incredible value engine that makes this unassuming commander so much fun to play. I like to think this is about as tuned as a low-budget Baba Lysaga deck is going to get, with choices that I think you'll find interesting. If, however, you're not here with the specific purpose of seeing a banger Baba deck, this deck is still well worth looking into for anyone that either likes aristocrat strategies, likes the Golgari color pairing, or simply likes off-the-wall decks where you play a bunch of weird cards one doesn't often get to see. The game plan is simple. It revolves around playing lots of permanents that synergize with your commander's ability. This means cards that either provide multiple permanents at once, have multiple permanent types, or have useful effects that provide value when they enter or leave the battlefield. You then use your commander to slowly build this pile of junk into a mountain of value, slowly dealing damage to your opponents along the way. That damage, while seeming insignificant at the time, quickly turns into death by 1,000 cuts. Let's talk about how to play the deck, starting with your opening hand. Given your commander has built-in card draw, I find your key targets in your opening hand should be having enough mana to ensure you're going to play Baba on curve, and some value sources of varied permanent types so that you'll be able to activate her ability. Of course, there are some strong cards in the deck, like Academy Manufactor, which if you get them, you're probably going to want to keep, provided that your hand outside of that isn't something dire like only having 2 mana sources. Your early game is really all about getting Baba out and getting her activated. I find people don't generally see her as much of a threat in the earlier stages of the game, even when you start activating her. Despite you drawing 3 cards, they're only losing 3 life each, which is pretty negligible when they're almost on 40 life. As such, I generally like to try and play into that by flying under the radar and not overly targeting my opponents, or doing anything that looks particularly scary. Luckily, half the cards you play look like hot trash under any other circumstances, so looking scary is actually quite difficult. The mid-game is all about building out your board. I don't typically expect to have any of the value engines out early, so this is really when one wants to do that. After that, you're going to want to continue building value with Baba, activating her ideally every turn. Outside of that, you want to create as many artifact tokens as possible so that you can start using them to whittle down your opponents, or perhaps even one-shot them. Speaking of one-shotting, let's talk about the late game. By this point, everyone's probably doing really scary things. Probably far scarier than you. Luckily for you, life totals are likely low enough that stringing together an activation or 2, plus the other aristocrat effects that you have in your deck, will likely be able to start killing off your opponents. Because of that, the pod will probably start seeing you as the threat that you are, so be prepared for that with your protection spells. I typically don't play one of my key win conditions unless I can either immediately do a bunch of damage or I have a spell to protect them. If one of the other players in the pod have started paying attention to you, dropping Mirkwood Bats or Nadia's Nightblade is certainly going to make them start running the numbers. Most of the time, that'll result in a proclamation that you are the problem. Better to set up a turn where you legitimately are the problem, rather than being the threat of a problem. Fortunately for us, it's actually pretty easy to string together some really nasty turns in the late game, where you can end up hitting the whole table for more than 20 damage.
Now that's a lot of damage!
Speaking of a lot, that's how many subscribers I hope to have after this video, as we're rapidly on track to hit 100. If you're enjoying this, you should like, subscribe, and comment to tell me your thoughts on this build. That way, others will get to see this video too, and you'll likely get to see my next brew, which is going to be a banger. When it comes to the weaknesses of the deck doesn't play that much removal, and that's because it's focused on playing cards that synergize well with the deck. That means if someone focuses you heavily in the early game, that could be a problem. The real threat, though, is cards like Farewell, Austere Command, and Cyclonic Rift. Like most decks that rely on building out a board, any of these cards is going to be a really bad time. And because of the colors we're in, there's not a whole lot that we can do to play around it. Fortunately, this is a value-based deck, so you're likely going to have a full hand of cards to rebuild, but it will still be painful. Now for the fun part, talking about all the cards that made it into the final build. Assembling this deck was quite fun, and building a budget version of it required some creative changes from the standard Baba Lysaga lists one sees online. As I talk through the deck, I'll talk about all the reasons for my choices. Starting with mana acceleration. The deck wants a fair bit of that, as you're likely going to be sacrificing a bunch of these mana sources along the way, including lands. You'll notice a decent split across permanent types between creatures, artifacts, and enchantments. If cards have more than one, even better. This is a theme across all the cards in the deck, to give us the utmost chance of activating Baba on every turn. As for the cards themselves, we start off with Leaden and Coppermere. They are merely simple mana rocks with multiple permanent types. We then have 4 creatures that either make great chump blockers or sacrifice targets to Baba and get us a land in the process. Shambling Ghast and Greedy Freebooter do a similar thing, but get us a treasure. Smeagol, meanwhile, sits on the sidelines and gets us a land every time one of these creatures dies. Additionally, the Ring Temps can be particularly useful, especially the one that gets us the draw and discard when a creature attacks. That's because we often have too many lands in our hand, and that filtering can get rid of them. Prize Statue and Mycosynth Wellspring both get us mana sources when they enter and leave the battlefield. And lastly, Utopia Sprawl, Wild Growth, and Abundant Growth either ramp or fix mana, but their big goal is being cheap enchantments that we can get rid of later in the game. The creatures in our deck are mostly fodder for Baba Lysaga, starting with Blisterpod, Nested Shambler, Tukatung Thallid, Messiah, and Tough Cookie, which all get us additional permanents when they enter or die. Ornithopter is a free artifact creature flyer. Eternal Witness gets us back something important later in the game. Silversmote Ghoul effectively becomes a creature we can sacrifice for free every turn, which is pretty busted. And lastly, Fang of Shigeki is simply a small scary blocker that also happens to be an enchantment. Moving on from creatures, this section is largely cards that again exist to be fodder for Baba Lysaga, but have interesting abilities along the way. Abilities that mostly get us extra permanence, or, in the case of Rancor and Spreading Elgai, get us cheap enchantments that we can recur every single turn. The removal in the deck is focused on synergizing really well with Baba Lysaga. Playing a Chime of Night and then sacrificing it to kill something feels pretty silly. Likewise, Mortality Spear is almost always simply an Assassin's Trophy. Lignify is arguably the strongest. The amount of times I've played this on an enemy commander and have them unable to do anything all game is too high. Our commander has built-in card draw, and therefore we don't run too many sources of card draw within the deck. The card draw that we do have again synergizes very well with Baba. Mephitic Draft and Ica Wellspring being cheap artifacts that both want to go to the graveyard. Demonic Law and Treacherous Blessing are both enchantments that usually have very horrible downsides. For us, those downsides don't exist. Lastly, we have Matsatlanti, the Great Door. Whilst its draw and discard ability can be pretty useful for filtering out lands in the late game, its real power comes from flipping it. I think by this point, it's probably pretty obvious how many permanents we're going to have in the graveyard, so you can imagine in the late game how much mana this thing can generate. Whilst in the early game, people generally leave Baba alone, by the late game, that's almost certainly not going to be the case. Therefore, we need a bit of protection. Royal Treatment and Not Dead After All both offer great ways to protect our commander, whilst also providing a permanent that we can sacrifice after the fact. The two most important parts of this deck are the engines and the win conditions. So let's take a look at the engines. First up is Academy Manufactor, who synergizes incredibly well with any of our food or treasure token creation. Fey Offering, which is arguably one of my favorite cards in the deck, is incredibly easy to proc, giving us a food, a treasure, and a clue token every turn cycle. Peregrine Took doubles our food. Killer Service gives us 4 permanents when we play it, and, if need be, can create some creatures for us. Ulvenwald Mysteries synergizes so well with many cards in our deck. Whenever a non-token creature dies, we investigate, and then when we sacrifice a clue, likely to our commander, we make a 1/1 white soldier token. Trail of Crumbs is a cheap enchantment that also makes us a food token. Interestingly, it can also help us filter through our deck. Old Rutstein, you've probably seen before, and he's good for making us a token per turn. A big challenge in moving to a budget version of this deck is removing cards like Exploration and Crucible of Worlds that allow us to play many lands per turn. Fortunately, On the Trail and Undergrowth Recon give us a way around this problem. They do this by allowing us to firstly play a second land every time we tap our commander, and secondly, recur lands from our graveyard at the beginning of our upkeep. Whilst I've seen other budget Baba decks play cards like Conduit of Worlds and Ruminant Excavator, it didn't make much sense to me, because despite being able to play lands from your graveyard, you can still only play 1 land per turn. And given the amount of cards we draw in this deck, we draw way too many lands as it is. Lastly, in this section, we have Instill Energy and Patriarch's Seal, both which allow us to untap our commander so we can activate her twice per turn. The win conditions of our deck are all focused around making our commander's activations all that much more painful for our opponents. Starting with a card that I'm almost certain you already know, Mirkwood Bats, which given its mana cost and its ability, likely make it the strongest win condition in the deck. Next up is Nadir's Nightblade and Agent of the Throne, both of which drain our opponents when either tokens or artifacts or creatures leave the battlefield. Whilst it comes in at a higher mana cost, Marionette Master is an incredible late game finisher that makes treasure tokens terrifying for your opponents. So Conrad the Grim is arguably one of the weaker win conditions in the deck in terms of synergy, but his ability triggers off so many creatures that he's just strong in general. From the Execution of Thane, whilst not explosive like Mirkwood Bats, is a great way to get some damage in the early to mid game. Starving Revenant pretty much doubles the damage your commander does on every activation. Lastly, Exsanguinate's in the deck to give us a bit of explosive power in the late game. This is especially true if you've managed to flip Matsatlanti, as the amount of damage we could do is incredible. It's always a challenge making those final few cuts when building a budget deck. And in this case, one of the big categories I had to cut was non-basic lands. Things like Artifact Lands, Colony Garden, and Dryad Arbor. Whilst most Baba decks would definitely run these, when building this deck, it just didn't seem to me like they'd have the biggest of impact, especially not when they would easily cost upwards of 20 to 30% of my budget. Whilst I'd normally spend some time in talking about deck upgrades, I think in this case, it's only fair to point you to the one and only Joey Schultz. If you want to build a more higher powered or expensive version of this deck, I strongly recommend you look at his build. As always, if you have thoughts on this deck, I'd love to hear them in the comments below.